It's structured corruption. There was a system that Guzman's organization had put together where they were bringing in 10-ton loads under the guise of importing cans of jalapenos. The thing that changed the importation dynamic was the passage of NAFTA. They decided, you know what? We're not going to bring these 10-ton loads anymore unless there's a crooked border guard. I knew one guy that paid $1 million to get 2 trucks waved through.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime and Entertainment. I have here today a very special guest. He is an expert on the cartels and the inner workings of the cartels. One of the reasons is he himself was charged with a drug kingpin statute back in 1998, done a great deal of time in prison. While in prison, became a prolific jailhouse lawyer and, helped get some other people out of jail. And he's got a vast knowledge of the cartels in this area where I kind of don't have as much. So it's a great interview we got for you today. Please welcome Pierre Rausini. Pierre, how are you, my friend?
Hello. How you doing, Wade?
I'm good, man. Look, we've had a conversation before we hopped on, and I mean, the conversation went for about an hour and some change.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm real excited to kind of, dive into this with you. Before we kind of do a backdrop of covering this thing from, years ago to now, there's kind of like a war going on right now immediately within the cartels. Lay the landscape out for what's going on right now for us.
Well, you essentially have the two most powerful factions of Sinaloa are engaged in full-on battle. Mm-hmm. And what prompted the event was the elder statesman within the cartel was an individual named Mayo Zambada, known throughout the community as El Mayo. And El Mayo was betrayed by Chapo Guzmán's son, who created a ruse, tricked him to come to a meeting, kidnapped him, and then flew him to the United States. And so in the process of Guzmán attempting to obtain consideration in the form of a sentence reduction for his cooperation, he wanted to bolster that magnitude of that cooperation by bringing the most wanted drug lord in the world to the table. Mm-hmm. And this, of course, precipitated what has turned into essentially 2 weeks now of all-out war, because the treachery exhibited by Guzmán's son broke every understanding of how things operate in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so at this point, there's going to be no chance of them getting Mayo back.
Right.
But going forward, this is a lesson to be made for every other faction to understand that this conduct is simply beyond the pale, and the consequences for it is going to be wiping every member of that crew out, their families out, because you have to understand, in Mexico, particularly since the mid-1970s, there's been a system in place called the plaza. Mm-hmm. And there are currently 27 plazas in the country, and each plaza has a boss who's responsible for collecting the taxes from all of the other traffickers operating in the area. And he's responsible then handing the money over to the political structure. So from the federal government on down, everybody gets their piece. Local officials, state level officials, federal politicians, and military officials. Well, the reason why Zambada had accumulated so much power was because here's a gentleman who was in his 70s. He'd been operating for 50 years. He'd been operating at a high level for 40 years. Well, this is someone whom every governor in Sinaloa for the last 40 years has been paying. So you accumulate a lot of networking.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, everybody that comes into place, they know, okay, this is the operation, this is how it is, this is how much you're going to be getting. Well, people are willing to do business with that man. And so this treachery by Guzmán's son has now brought him to the United States, where in the event he were to flip, it literally is going to put in jeopardy the entire system. Because every politician for at least 3 decades in the areas of responsibility that he handled dealt with him or his representative.
Right. So Guzmán's son gets arrested. He then makes a deal to flip and basically turn over the other guy. And they didn't have a lot of on him, Zambada. They didn't really know a lot about him, right? Wasn't he essentially kind of like a ghost to the
Well,
authorities?
Zambada has been charged in about a half a dozen federal prosecutions in the last 30 years. The problem the government, our government has, is that he's very discreet. He's not one of those guys taking pictures in front of a Hummer holding an AR.
Right.
That was Joaquin Guzman, Chapo, who did that kind of silliness.
Right.
This guy was actually the brains behind that syndicate. And he was very, low profile. And the problem that our authorities had was that he's very good at insulating himself. And unlike a lot of the other individuals, he's an expert at networking. And so by the time, I was in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles serves as the American base of operations for the Sinaloa cartel. Particularly, even to this day, the importation base is still out of LA. And he'll have 3 or 4 representatives in Los Angeles. Not a very large network. They just farm out to everybody else.
Okay.
And so it's very difficult to build a case against someone who has so many layers.
Yeah, he's insulated himself from what's going on very well, it seems. How did they capture Guzman? Son.
The Ivan Guzman, the one who betrayed El Mayo, wasn't captured. His brother the year before, Ovidio, was captured. And so this event, he was closest with that particular brother. They had different mothers.
Okay.
And so Ovidio and Ivan are blood brothers. The other ones that are currently in place are half brothers. And he saw an opportunity to help. One, he's been charged. The brother that's already in federal custody has been charged. And so this was essentially what the government characterizes as third-party cooperation. So the one in Mexico turns himself in, brings Mayo to the table in order for himself and his brother to earn sentence reductions based on the betrayer's cooperation.
And so it sounds like they're letting, certain fish go to kind of catch a big fish, much like they did with, Sammy and John Gotti. They let Sammy walk on, 19 murders, all to just get John Gotti, who I don't really know if he may have ordered the murders. I don't really, to this day, it's kind of a mystery how many, ones that Gotti committed himself, if any. But that kind of seems like what this is. They let, maybe a worse guy go just to catch the guy that had the name value.
Well, the thing that's interesting is, the golden era for Sinaloa was between, let's say, 2003 and 2010. And Zambada was right at the center of that operation. Subsequent to 2010, things really began to disintegrate. So when the American government today talks about the Sinaloa cartel, most people are thinking about that 2003 to 2010 period. Well, the operation today, the syndicate today, is a fraction of what it was previously. Today, it's not really a cartel. Cartel is actually a misnomer because cartels are a confederation of organizations that collude to control price. Well, they never control price. They're all competing against each other on price. And so what essentially it is a confederation of organizations that band together to assist each other for specific functions. Okay. Some guys have control of the ports. Some guys have control of the border. Some guys have control of a crooked politician. So they're transactional relationships when it's mutually beneficial to work with each other. And the problem that our current short-term thinking government has is that they took the 76-year-old man off the market when it's actually the guys that are in their 30s that are causing the problems in our country. See, Zambada, there was after Chapo Guzman got knocked off in 16, he gets sent to the United States in 17. Well, there was problems within the cartel because Zambada's faction did not want to get involved with the synthetic opioids that are currently causing the problems in our country. But the consequence of knocking Joaquin Guzman off was that it allowed his much younger sons, who have a lot less experience, to get involved and start making decisions. Joaquin Guzman, El Mayo Zambada, these were guys that came from the old era, from back in the mid-'80s, when the predecessor group, the Guadalajara cartel, made the mistake of killing a DEA agent. That in turn prompted an enormous response from the American government. And ultimately, it resulted in the leadership of the Guadalajara cartel getting wiped out. And it was when that organization was taken down that their local franchises essentially became their own little independent operation. So Sinaloa was a plaza of the old Guadalajara. Juarez, Tijuana, these were standalone organizations after the leadership got wiped out. And so the first full year of Sinaloa's operations was in 1990.
Mm-hmm.
One of the principal rules that was put in place, not that there's too many rules, but there were some. And one of them is do not harm American law enforcement.
Yeah.
Under no circumstances are you to cut the product with any compound that's going to harm the American consumer. Essentially, do not do anything that's going to awaken the slumbering giant.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think, and I don't know how much you know about the, the Medellin side of things, but I think that's really what started bringing down heat on Pablo. Is I want to say there was a plane blew up, or that he had taken down, that had an American. I forgot the rank he had, but he was some high ranking American, and that really kind of lit the fire up under America to start going after Pablo. So it seems like when Americans get touched,
Sure.
that's when we step in and kind of really start to crank down on, trying to get some order going.
Yeah. And so like, when I was active, there was no harming of Americans, essentially.
Yeah.
Like you could go into Tijuana, you can go into Rosarita, you can go to Cabo, like in America, they stay away. Yeah. Because they simply knew that it was too bad for business. Well, the individuals, that era of individuals, Zambada, Guzmán, Amaro Carrillo, Nacho Coronel, all those guys that later on built the Sinaloa and Juarez cartels, well, they're now out of the picture. They're either dead, or in the case of Guzmán, in prison. Zambada's in New York facing trial. Well, all we have now are the sons and subsequent generation. So the guys coming of age today weren't around in the 80s. And so what you have now is this essentially a race to the bottom where the competing organizations are scrambling to maximize profit on every single unit. It's really a short-term thinking, and it's a fundamental change in how the black market is structured, because in my era, you didn't try to maximize profit per unit. You simply sold a lot more product. Mm-hmm. You made up the difference in volume. Well, today, that's not how things are structured, because, 30 years ago, those men dedicated their lives to building something, and they were building it to last generations. That's simply not the case today. One, you've got changes in Mexico at the behest of the American government, which allows for the exportation, the deportation to America of large Mexican drug traffickers. Well, prior to 2006, there was no extradition. Mm-hmm. So after 2006, you now start seeing the expansive shootouts. Like they're not going quietly, because they know if they end up in America, they're going to be at LAX with Chapo.
Yeah.
And so now you start thinking, well, if they're going to play that game with us, well, then screw the American consumer. They're already coming after these guys anyway. Now there's nothing to lose. And so you've got this incessant need now to accumulate as much money as possible, because in Mexico, power is defined by access to corrupt politicians. Mm-hmm. Not military, not men, not arms, crooked politicians. And so in the case of today, for instance, you've got a new group, relatively new, about 14 years old now, called the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. And although it's the second largest cartel, it's the most powerful of the two. Now, this is a much more militarized operation. Well, they are the ones who have taken the production of synthetics to an industrial scale. And so the crisis that we've had in the country essentially since 2016, where you've had every year higher levels of fatality stemming from the fentanyl dilemma, mm-hmm. is in large part due to Jalisco. Well, to the guys in Sinaloa, they start seeing their rival cartel accumulating more money, which translates into more political power. That's where you had Guzmán's organization. After Guzmán goes to prison, his sons are trying to keep up with the Joneses, essentially. So they go all in on the fentanyl. Meanwhile, the older, more wiser head on the Zambada side, he's like, hey, look, this is a problem, because you can't kill 100,000 civilians in the United States every year.
Yeah. And not have a consequence.
Yeah. And so essentially what you had was a struggle within those two groups, a conflict between the two bigger cartels, and at some point, sometime around 2023, even Zambada himself folded.
Mm-hmm.
His group now got involved with producing fentanyl, which is what led to the 2024 indictment. Now, the indictment that was returned earlier this year in February was actually what's called a superseding indictment, which means it's built upon a prior indictment already in place. Well, the original indictment was from 2009. So this is now the fifth iteration. But this was the first one where you see Zambada's being charged principally with fentanyl, which is, of course, at his age, it doesn't matter because it's a life sentence no matter what.
Right.
But what you saw, okay, keep on.
Oh, I was just going to add, where do you see this going? I mean, because these are some major players here, and do you think El Chapo even knows what's going on? Like, I mean, I know in ADX you're very, very, coordinated off. I mean, there's little to no interaction with anyone. Do you think he even has a clue of what's going on out there?
Um, Guzman's got a problem in the sense that he only has a third grade education. He's not very literate.
Really?
I was in prison with some guys that were substantial traffickers. One of them, 100-ton guy, owned 2 ranches in Mexico, probably the size of Vermont, each one. Tens of thousands of head of cattle, just enormous operations. The guy had a second grade education. Like he read these little Mexican comic books. And so for those kind of individuals, it's difficult because you're not going to be able to use the email system because he can't read.
Right.
They're very limited on their phone calls. He can't get newspapers sent in. He can't get magazines sent in. So yeah, there's a very good chance that Guzman has no idea or has only a brief understanding of what's going on.
Wow. And then that's you think too, because like I'm sure he would have an opinion on this, or he would maybe give his son some advice, but with the section off as that ADX is. And for people that don't know, just to give you some context, ADX is where they hold guys like Ramzi Youssef, who was responsible for the original World Trade Center bombing back in 1994. I believe Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is there, who was responsible for helping put together the September 11 attacks. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, is there. There's some high profile guys up in this place. I think Barry Mills was there. He was one of the original head honchos of the Aryan Brotherhood. Even what's the guy, the mobster from Chicago, Joe Lombardo, was there because he threatened a federal judge. So it's a serious place where there's like little to no interaction at all. So it's kind of crazy that all this is going on, directly involving people, his sons, and he really has no idea.
Well, from the son's perspective, once Ivan made the decision he's going to cross this guy out to benefit him and his other brother, then it was simply executing a plan. What is interesting is going to be the fallout, because at this point, we may ultimately see Joaquin Guzman cooperate. Because one of the principal witnesses against Joaquin Guzman was Zambada's son, Vicente, the earlier son, the oldest son, the heir apparent
Right.
to that network. Another key witness for the prosecution was Zambada's brother. And so you had key members of Zambada's organization and direct family members who cooperated against Joaquin Guzman. And so the sons can rationalize their actions, but the conduct they engaged in broke the understanding. And like we were talking about earlier, in the context of, your show is much more geared towards organized crime and in particular the mafia. And so you're more of a subject matter expert on things related to Cosa Nostra. You got a lot more experience in that particular subject matter. And one of the principal rules in that world is there are no unauthorized or unsanctioned hits on bosses.
Yeah. Or at least that's how it's supposed to be.
That's how it's supposed to be. And so, in fact, after, Gotti took Castellano out, there were efforts by Gigante to take Gotti out.
Yes.
Well, that's because Gotti broke the cardinal rule, which was making a move against another boss. Well, that's essentially what Guzman's sons did, which is what precipitated this conflict, because there is no organization in Mexico that will accept that kind of treachery, because every kingpin is now subject to someone pulling this kind of a move off.
And it's supposed to add somewhat of a security measure, especially when you're in that ranking, that position. And people, I don't think that maybe aren't really clued into the subject matter think, oh, it's the mafia, oh, it's the cartel. They actually have very, structured rules that you should follow, largely to keep, people from going to prison, or to keep, if someone does get caught, to hopefully seal off and nobody gives out any information. But it is to maintain some order. If you reach that boss status, you are supposed to be protected, unless, the other heads of the table or the commission, however you want to word it, would agree that you would be taken out. And if that comes to that, you probably know it's coming already. The writing would kind of be on the wall, but there are rules in place. I think people think because they are, they're into that sort of criminal activity, that we know there's no honor amongst thieves, or however you want to put it. But there is rules and orders that you're supposed to follow. And when they are broken, it does create anarchy amongst the other people, and fear, because like you said, anybody in that high position now knows that they can, be subject to this.
Well, particularly in Mexico, it's much more structured. It may not necessarily be characterized as rules, but it's an understanding, it's a norm, because there the criminal syndicates work hand in hand with political figures. So you have to undertake action to make sure that you don't put them at risk.
Mm-hmm.
And Guzman's son has placed the entire political network at risk, which is why you see such a ferocious response. You've got, Zambada's son now that's in charge, El Maito. He's unleashed essentially every hitman in Sinaloa to go get Guzman's kids. In fact, do you speak Spanish? There's Spanish language programming on YouTube. I saw a couple episodes where they have the recordings of Maito Flaco giving out instructions to his men, like essentially like the walkie-talkie recordings. And he's telling them, hey, look, don't worry about the police. They're there to make sure civilians aren't getting harmed. They're standing aside. Like everybody from the military, the police, the political structure, everybody is supporting this move against Guzman's organization. And so what we're seeing now, and we'll see in the near future, is essentially the dismantling of what at one point was probably one of the most powerful independent organizations. It's going to be reduced to rubble. The event that precipitated Ivan Guzman's betrayal was the arrest of his brother in 2023. Once the brother was extradited to the United States, he's essentially looking at a life sentence, because within the Sinaloa context, this is the group that really pioneered the manufacturing and distribution of fentanyl. And absent some extraordinary level of assistance, the brother's going to get a life sentence. And so Ivan Guzman begins, the guy in Mexico at the time, begins reaching out to the Americans. And so what was interesting is, following their arrest, there were a couple of days there where representatives from the FBI and Homeland Security and these agencies were acting as if this was all part of some, crackerjack law enforcement operation, when in reality, this was completely conceived of by Guzman's son. And so he came along with the idea of turning himself in and bringing with him the most wanted narco in the world. And so, although there was tension within the groups, there's still some level of interaction. And so in Sinaloa, the political structure oftentimes rely on Zambada, who at that point, like I said, is in his mid-70s. He's a respected elder. And so there was a dispute between the governor of the state of Sinaloa, along with a local politician that was a political opponent. And so when you have a dispute over, government spoils, they say, okay, well, let's go talk to the old man. He'll make a decision. And everybody knows that his judgment is fairly sound, and they'll respect whatever the decision is going to be. And so he gets invited to participate in this meeting between these two political figures. Well, Guzman's son somehow gets connected with this meeting, and he shows up with a detail of, from what was reported, a half a dozen men. Now, because Zambada's meeting with political figures, he didn't show up with 25 or 30 guys. He's meeting with the governor, he's meeting with political guy, and he's meeting with his godson. He didn't anticipate this form of a betrayal. And so when he comes to the meeting, The two politicians are there. Guzman's son is there. Guzman's son asks to speak with him privately in the other room before they sit down with the politicians. So the information released by Zambada's attorney indicates that Zambada followed Guzman's son into the other room, where he was then assaulted by the half a dozen men. Tied up, they beat him, tie him up, put a potato sack over his head. They go into the other room and they kill they unalive the individual, not the governor, the other political figure.
Mm-hmm.
They kidnap Zambada and they take him to the little municipal airport. They put him on the plane, and Guzman's son, along with Zambada, are on the aircraft, and the plane flies to land at a municipal airport outside of El Paso, which is technically in New Mexico. And when the aircraft arrived, Americans had no idea that Zambada was on the flight. They go out there thinking, okay, Guzman's turning himself in. He's been speaking for months about a possible turn-in.
Mm-hmm.
And, look, these conversations happen on background all the time. Things are very different in Mexico than how it's perceived within the American underworld, essentially. Down there, relationships between law enforcement are hand in glove. And so there's a free flow of communication between the parties. And so when Guzman's son, for this extended period, was negotiating a possible surrender, look, Zambada had been talking to them for years himself. They just don't act on it. And so when he actually showed up, boom, they go out to pick the guy up. There's Zambada. Mm-hmm. And so he was essentially an offering on his part saying, look, I'm coming in. I'm going to plead guilty. And I want my brother and I to benefit in the form of consideration, which this level of cooperation will certainly impact the magnitude of his sentencing reduction. And that, of course, is what ultimately precipitated this war in Sinaloa. Now, Zambada has numerous charges all over the country. There was an indictment brought against him in Texas in 2012. But the indictment in New York is from 2009, and it's been superseded on a number of occasions, including most recently in February of 24. And so the Department of Justice ultimately made the decision, although he made his initial appearance in Texas, they thought that for security reasons, bring the case in the Southern District. Also, there are tactical reasons for bringing the case in the Southern District as opposed to the Texas indictment, and especially the Chicago indictment, because the Chicago indictment was a case that was flawed or highly questionable activity became central in that case. So I'm sure the Americans are going to do whatever they can to get them into a venue where the judge in New York isn't bound by the judge in Chicago's findings.
And these are all charges that Zambada has all over all these different states that you're talking about?
Certainly, yes.
Jesus
Zambada
Christ.
has probably a half a dozen indictments. The one in New York, and I have a copy of the indictment right here. It's February 24, and 17-count indictment. Count one is in what's called a continuing criminal enterprise charge.
That's the RICO charge?
Which is the federal drug kingpin statute. And it would be the equivalent, the drug trafficking equivalent to a RICO, essentially. Okay. This is the kingpin provision, which essentially mandates a life prison sentence.
Yeah, I was about to say, you're looking at life with that RICO tacked on there.
You're looking for a life sentence with respect to the product. And in the event there's a homicide, that's the 848E offense, where now you're looking at a life, if not a capital charge, which was the nature of the prosecution brought in my case.
Okay.
And so I'm familiar with the CC&Es, essentially. And, the government's case is, at this point, essentially bulletproof. I mean, they've got a 35-year conspiracy charging him from January of 1989 all the way through February of 2024. It begins its genesis with the formation of the early Sinaloa cartel, and it progresses to what ultimately became known as the Federation, which was the groups that came together to essentially fight off the Zetas and the Tijuana cartel up until the golden era from 2003 to 2010. And you essentially have, just count one alone, there's 17 overt acts in the furtherance of this conspiracy. And the government just, with this particular group out of Colombia, they got 12 transactions, 3,000 kilos, 12,000 kilos, 15,000 kilos. This is just enormous numbers.
Now,
And
is one going to supersede the other? Does he have to deal with one first? Or are they going to, how would they do that when he's got charges all over all these different states?
well, see, the government has to be careful in the sense that they cannot charge the same conspiracy twice. And so, like how the government got away with that in my case, like in one of my cases, it was a conspiracy prosecution, and then another one they charged the substantive acts. So the
Mhm.
acts and the furtherance of the conspiracy was one case, and then the conspiracy was a separate case.
Okay.
And then the judge in the conspiracy case said, well, this is actually two separate conspiracies. So now that morphed. You got an LA conspiracy, San Francisco conspiracy, substantive counts in Honolulu. Zambada doesn't have that. They
Mhm.
brought the whole boat essentially against him with respect to the drug trafficking activity. Now, where he's in potentially big trouble is the Texas prosecution contains, some unalivings essentially,
Right.
and that's not going to be subject to uh, double jeopardy defense. And the problem for Zambada is the Mexican Supreme Court in 2006 authorized the extradition of Mexican nationals to the United States for the purposes of prosecution, even if they were going to face a life sentence.
Mhm.
They would not extradite somebody who's facing a capital charge. Zambada's in a difficult situation because his Texas indictment are death eligible offenses. He wasn't extradited. He was brought here. Now he's claiming it's against his will, but the Supreme Court, in connection with the earlier mess back in the early 90s surrounding the Kiki Camarena murder, held that a Mexican national brought to the United States against his will, that fact is irrelevant. Once he's on American soil, he can be prosecuted.
Mhm.
So the fact that Zambada was essentially kidnapped and brought here is not going to give him a defense. Now, Zambada's attorneys are already claiming that it's inconceivable that the American authorities didn't have any prior knowledge. Because if they authorized the operation or even tacitly approved it, now it's a different kettle of fish.
Mhm.
Which is why the U.S. attorney has already came forward and said, we did not know he was on the plane. That was not our aircraft. That was not our pilot. Like they're disavowing any association to this man's capture. And because he was brought to the United States under circumstances that he was brought in, after he gets the life sentence in New York, he could very well be taken to Texas for the purposes of the capital charge.
Mhm. What, and just out of curiosity, what are the charges going to be reduced to for the brothers that turned him over? I mean, like, are they going to walk? Or are they just going to get very like slaps on the
No,
wrist? I'm kind of curious to that
well,
because
the thing
he
is
seems
this:
like a big guy.
yes, both sons are in the same circumstance in that they're looking at life sentences. Well,
Right.
the way the government rewards cooperators is they'll file a new charging document limiting the scope of the conspiracy.
Hmm.
Therefore, they're going to put a ceiling on how far high it's going to go. You're not going to start from life.
Right.
They may charge this particular count and then exclude all of the other counts because of the cooperation agreement. So, for
Ah.
instance, like one of the guys in my case who was responsible for probably 100 kilos, the government let him plead guilty to 1 kilo. And then under the sentencing guidelines, he was able to say, okay, well, we're not going to consider that as a result of his cooperation and him discussing it. So he ultimately got 1 month. Another guy got 3 months. Now, Guzman's sons obviously are going to end up with substantial sentences, 10 years, 15 years. That's nothing, it's a significant sentence, but it's
Mhm.
not going to be a life term.
Right. So there's a slight bit of light at the end of the tunnel.
There's a light at the end of the tunnel. And you have to understand, like Mayo Zambada's son, Vicente Zambada, who was a major trafficker in his own right, he ended up getting like 14 years.
Okay.
And that's, post cooperation. And so between the government's charging decisions on how they're going to reward the Guzman brothers for the purposes of cooperation, the ceiling they're going to put in place, and then the magnitude of the cooperation reduction,
Mhm.
and they could easily end up with a number of somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 years.
And would that'll be in American or over in America, right? Prison system in
Yes,
America.
those will be served in American prisons, and given the nature of their cooperation, they'll probably be permitted to remain in the country.
Okay.
And that's ultimately what happened with quite a few of the big guys out of Mexico. Vicente Zambada, uh, El Rey, Zambada's brother, just talk about another very significant trafficker. I don't want to put his business out there, but he's now living in California. And so these were, massive multiple ton players who are essentially part of their cooperation package is what's called an S1 visa.
Okay.
And so
Should
it's
they
a
be
very
scared for retribution for what they did while in
well
prison?
the Guzman brothers, yes,
Yeah,
simply because the other groups have an incentive to punish them irrespective of where they are.
I got
The other individuals, no. That's not the way things work in Mexico. If you're a large scale trafficker in Mexico, you get the green light, cooperate.
you. Okay.
Their thing is make sure all the other guys are out of the country. You know what I
I
mean? That's not like how things are perceived within like the American, criminal gang culture or how it's depicted with respect to certain ethnic groups. It doesn't work that way at all. Obviously that's why even cooperation is not a basis for a cartel to send people to the United States to do something.
I got you.
Now, individuals may do so if you book somebody's brother or if you set up their father. That's a personal beef you may have,
That's a
but it's
personal,
not
but
coming
not.
from the organization.
I got you.
Yeah. The only time the organization itself will send people is in relation to theft. And that's what got Zambada in trouble with respect to the Texas indictment, because the unaliving in connection with that case concerned theft of product. And so the people went into Texas, apprehended the individual in Texas, and then brought him back to Mexico. Well, the law enforcement community, particularly federal law enforcement in Texas, are not going to stand for people coming into their state, kidnapping Americans and taking them into the other country. And so I think Zambada is going to be in a ton of trouble, even though he's going to show up with presumably already a life sentence. Because in this indictment, it breaks it down into we've got essentially 12 and 56, 68, 72 counts broken down into three classes of categories. So, 1 through 12, count one, overt acts 1 through 12 are connected with one particular Colombian organization. Then overt acts, 13 through 56 are a second organization. And then the last four are a third organization. So what that tells you is that they've already got the Colombians in custody.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Chapo Guzman's trial, you had a number of very high ranking Colombian officials coming in. You had very high ranking Mexican cartel level operatives testifying. Like in the Mexican context, once they got you in the United States, do what you need to do because the Mexican guys are banking on not getting caught.
Okay.
Now what happened with Guzman was he had been built up into such a high level, almost mythical figure that the government was never going to come to him and offer him anything of. First of all, they know that he wasn't really the leader.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, he was built up to essentially like an Osama bin Laden status. And so he was just in a position where he had no cards he could play. Now, Zambada, assuming he wants to possibly cross that threshold, he may be in a position to say, hey, look, and this president, these senators, but that's essentially a betrayal of everything he has lived for. And as a 76-year-old man, you really don't know what's the benefit he's going to get.
Yeah, I don't know if he would, betray everything he's lived for, like I said, in that belief system and that lifestyle up until now. That he could just kind of take it and go on in the system, and essentially whatever they gave, if they give him 10 years, that would probably be.
Yeah, that's a death sentence anyway. He's already, in a wheelchair. He's not in very good medical condition.
Mhm.
And if anything, he could be preserving the position for his son.
Correct.
Because as of right now, he's got his son, Maito Flaco, he's in his 40s, and he's been thrust into this leadership position. And the political structure would reward the son in exchange for the father
Keeping
not
quiet.
doing, yeah, keeping quiet. And so it's going to be interesting, never say never, but I just can't imagine the American government ever given this guy a package sweet enough to justify it. Like, he's not going to go to a regular prison. They're going to put him at the ADX. Like, I mean, at some point, there's just nothing to negotiate with. And the attorneys that he have, of course, are top notch. And so, I just checked the docket a couple days ago, and basically all you have now are the attorneys filing their notice of appearances. And we're getting ready to see essentially a massive battle, because what hasn't really been identified so far here in the New York case, and which was prevalent in his son's case in Chicago, which at some point later on we can discuss, was the fact that there was a relationship between Sinaloa and high-ranking American government officials for a number of years. And when the son got arrested, he actually got arrested leaving a meeting in a luxury hotel in Mexico City after he had met with a bunch of high-ranking DOJ and DEA officials down from Washington, D.C. Mexicans had no idea that there are American operatives on their soil, because they're supposed to report in. So they're hiding the relationship from the Mexican government. You have to understand, in Mexico, the situation is very different. You can ask anybody in that country, and they're convinced that the cartels are in bed with our government.
Yeah, I believe that.
And so that issue became front and center, because when Vicente Zambada got arrested, he said, hey, I'm here on behalf of my father, who's authorized me to represent our organization with the DEA and the DOJ. And the government initially tried denying it. Then they were able to prove that the meeting happened. Now the government starts invoking national security. And so the situation got really scandalous. And they essentially put the entire case to bed by giving the son 14 years. Now, if Zambada tries to play that card where, hey, look, I have a relationship, this was at least tacitly approved for these number of years, well, that kind of blows a hole in the center of the case. It doesn't exonerate him, but it's going to create defenses that may, in fact, give him leverage to negotiate a much more favorable deal. And so we're going to start keeping an eye on this case, because the legal machinations are going to get very heated. Mm-hmm. And if there's one thing the American government's going to do, which they did in Chapo's case, was keep all mention of the relationship with Sinaloa out of court.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how this plays out.
Yeah, because it was actually Zambada's organization that had the relationships. And so that's the reason why I believe they took him to New York rather than Chicago. Because there's already factual findings made in Chicago that are, from the government's perspective, very unfavorable. So this is basically a clean slate. And so, I certainly look forward to coming on your channel, because next time there's something significant, we'll pull the pleadings and we'll analyze the motions.
All right, my friend. Sounds good, Pete.